Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Find out more about our white papers, our legislative work with the General Assembly in session. This is our busy time there, our Tuesday morning group coalition meetings, and how we have been what a lot of people in the trades call a do tank, more than we think too, but so many places it's just about the thinking. We put the do after the thinking. Jim Carafano joins us next here on Freedom and Prosperity Radio. He's the vice president of the Kathryn and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy, a mouthful, at the Heritage Foundation. And Jim, thank you for taking some time out this week with us. Happy New Year. I hope all is going well.
Yeah, good to be with you.
So let's start to break down what's going on in the Middle East, Iran, Iraq. I feel a little bit like, from where I'm sitting, I'm a checkers expert broadcasting a chess match. So I hope you can help us put a little perspective on it, especially in light of the missile strikes that all sort of landing somewhere. It was like Wile E. Coyote shooting his Acme rockets at the U.S. military bases. But as somebody pointed out to me, they've hit some fairly faraway targets very accurately with their cruise missiles. So was, first and foremost, the reaction to the death of Qasem Suleimani, their reaction, was it intentionally off target, do you think, from where you stand and from what you've heard?
Right. So let's just step way back, and then we'll jump way in. So, people will go, why are we in the Middle East to begin with? We're self-sufficient in oil now. Why do we even need to be there? And I think you have to start from understanding the perspective that the United States is a global power with global interests and global responsibilities, just who we are, which means that we have to get around the world. So we either have to be present to protect our interests, or we have to be able to get to that part of the world to do that. Three parts of the world really knit everything together: Europe, the greater Middle East, and Asia. And what the United States wants is not that these have to be the land of milk and honey, but it's really in our interest that there's not a major regional destabilization in any of those three, because they really knit the United States to the rest of the world. And in the Middle East, the two grave threats to regional stability are transnational Islamist terrorism and Iran. And when the administration came into office, they kind of went laser focused on dealing with both of those. So physically, the destruction of the caliphate, reducing the Islamist threat in the Middle East, and then at the same time pulling out of the Iran deal, which was negotiated under President Obama, which is actually a great enabler for allowing Iran to become more aggressive in the region. Mm-hmm. So pulling out of the deal and really instituting a policy of pressuring the regime. And so the regime's tried many different ways to push back on that. The latest one is to essentially weaponize the militias in Iraq that they had funded and control to directly attack American assets, to drive us from the region. And our response to that was not only to take out the militia elements that attacked the U.S., but when Suleimani, who is the head of the Quds Force, which is part of the Iranian National Guard that is responsible for overseas operations, controlling the surrogates, and directing counterterrorism operations, when he came into Iraq to directly coordinate further attacks on U.S. bases, we took him out. So it's all consistent with the strategy that we've been really pursuing since the president came into office. And so taking out Suleimani was a huge deal. He was a very powerful figure in Iran. And this part of the world, honor is power. If somebody slaps you and you don't have the ability to hit them back, then you are seen as weak and feckless. Mm-hmm. So you can't afford not to look strong. So the Iranians had said, well, we need to respond to this in some way. And so that, I think, is what the missile attack was intended to do. But as you pointed out, they really didn't strike much of anything. Essentially, it was a face-saving fireworks display that killed a bunch of sand. The Iranians almost immediately signaled that they're done. Right. And as long as the United States didn't retaliate by attacking Iranian soil, they wouldn't do anything else, which I think just reinforced the notion that this was nothing more than really kind of, a face-saving gesture on their part, which might work with people that already support the regime, but I think to the rest of the world, they clearly see that this was just a very reckless and unnecessary provocation.
Jim, the president has very intentionally, through a lot of his speeches, if you can get past the sound of Nancy Pelosi holding on to the impeachment papers or Chuck Schumer talking about bumbling and things like that. But I find very tactically and tactfully always referring to the people of these countries, whether it be Iran or Turkey, and he seems to be talking past their regimes to them. It certainly is a long game, but it reminds me of when Reagan would talk about the Russian people rather than the Soviet dictatorship, and try to encourage the internal uprisings that we're seeing in Iran. Is that intentional? And if it isn't, can we at least convince him to keep doing it?
Well, I know. I think this administration's gone out of its way, particularly in the case of Iran, to make the distinction between the regime and the people of Iran. It's widely recognized that Iran is generally a very well-educated, pro-Western population that actually is inclined to engage with the West, actually would be pro-American if it wasn't for the regime that was on top of them. And clearly there's an enormous amount of dissatisfaction, and it has been for some time. Under President Obama, there was actually something called the Green Revolution, in which people rose up in the streets and protested against the government. Unfortunately, our response to that was basically to side with the government. I mean, now we're seeing this again. Matter of fact, the demonstrations have been so volatile that several hundred people have been killed, and thousands have been wounded. And part of the reason why many people in Iran, if they could, would go out and cheer the death of Qasem Soleimani, because he actually was responsible for having coordinated the oppression and the suppression of protests in Iran. So it's not a terribly popular government. I think the U.S. clearly recognizes that, and they try to make that distinction.
Is it something that we can work, whether it be the sort of, pop culture, radio-free Tehran, broadcasts internet, or do we need to have some sort of, undercover operations supporting these, revolutionaries, if you want to call them that?
No, I don't think there's much that we can do. I mean, much like the Soviet occupation of Central Europe during the Cold War, at the end of the day, freedom will come from the people themselves. We just being who we are, that is a message that is conveyed to people who are under oppression. And but authoritarian regimes are very rigid, very much in control. That's their nature, until the people themselves destroy its legitimacy and the fragility of that regime appears. Look, the United States is not going to try to change the government of Iran. We can't do that. If the government of Iran changes from within, that's up to the Iranian people. We can't pressure that from without any more than we could, during the Cold War. What we have to do is protect our interests and be true to our values and our freedoms and our liberties, and set a good example. And I think what we've done, speak to the Iranian people, recognize their cry for freedom, and that's our responsibility. But then it's up to the Iranian regime if they want to change and adapt and liberalize and meet the needs of their people, or if they want to continue to stonewall, and then someday they'll wind up like Hitler and Stalin and all the other guys that in the end failed.
Yeah, we don't want to, and we won't teach that history anymore either. Jim Carafano is on with us, Vice President at the Heritage Foundation, National Security Foreign Policy. Jim, you mentioned our values and our beliefs. And we talk about our adventures in the Middle East, and a lot of it goes back to an era when we were trying to build NATO, at least as I look at the history of it. And Britain wasn't happy with Iran's parliament and their insistence that they had sovereignty over the oil. And that British Petroleum, if I understand the story correctly, I wasn't born yet at the time, that they said British Petroleum can stay, but they have to pay us for the oil fields that they're leasing from us. And the Queen and Parliament in Britain said, we really don't like this, whether it was Alan Dulles or we just did it more overtly than that. We helped with the parliamentary regime change, giving the Shah more direct and complete power in Iran. Are our mistakes always seemingly tracked back to where we choose treaty?
Well, look, here's part of the problem, which is
versus value. I mean, our value is sovereignty.
With hindsight, everybody makes mistakes. The problem is you have to live in the times that you are, and you're kind of stuck with your mistakes that you make. And
the notion
that you can do foreign policy and not have mistakes is just kind of fatuous. I mean, so.
But we didn't choose our value.
No, but the flip I would say is the United States has literally had a successful Middle East policy since the end of World War II. That region was never controlled by a foreign power. The U.S. has always had access to it. And even though we've had some terrible wars, like the Arab-Israeli wars, we've never lost the stability in that region. So you could argue for all our mistakes and faults and misdeeds, our foreign policy in the Middle East has been a success from 1945 to today.
That's an interesting take on it, and I agree. I know that when you brought up values, it reminded me that sometimes we seem to choose treaty over our own values of like sovereignty and property ownership. But let's circle to the president's moves in Israel. You talk about the Arab-Israeli conflicts and some of those that flash a little bit, but have been there. Does a lot of this begin with the president's stand with the Israeli people, with Benjamin Netanyahu moving the embassy to Jerusalem and sort of signaling to the world that Israel was going to be a stronger member, or signaling to Israel that they're a better friend than they've been over the last few years?
Well, I think there's an unrecognized strategic logic behind all this because, like I said, the United States is a global power. It has to connect the dots on the globe. That's Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. And in each situation from a geostrategic perspective, we have an ally that essentially is our anchor into the region, the one country that we can always depend on. We always have access. We always have a partner. We always have an intel partner. We always have a physical partner where we can bring our ships and planes. It's really our anchor into the region, what makes us a transatlantic power or a Middle East power or a Pacific power. And Europe, really since 1914 or 1917, that has been Great Britain. Great Britain has been America's unsinkable aircraft carrier. It is our anchor into Europe. In the Indo-Pacific, it's really been Japan. Japan is what anchors America as a Pacific power in the Pacific. They went from being the greatest nemesis to our most important ally. And in the Middle East, it is Israel. Israel is the indispensable ally because it's the one country that we can always depend on. It's the one strategic partner that brings real capability to the table. It's a vibrant democracy. It is the freest free market economy, but it is a free market economy, and it is and always will be America's essential ally that makes America a Middle East power.
Then what about the message this might send to other Middle Eastern countries, I think specifically in terms of Saudi Arabia, how we're dealing with Iran? I think back to the coalition that was there in Gulf War, where Saddam Hussein was clearly this bank robber and country invader that everyone rallied to, where you had Arabs and Israelis flying together like a scene out of Independence Day, but you actually had that in reality for a little while. What message does our foreign policy, as it refers to Iran and Iraq, trickle into Saudi Arabia and some of the other Arab nations that we work with?
Well, virtually every country in that region sees the greatest danger to their future today is Iran. And that is why, with the possible exception of Turkey, which arguably is quasi part of the Middle East, but every country literally looks to strengthening its relationship with Israel, not just because Israel is an ally of the United States and they want to strengthen the United States, but because they need a more coherent, united front against Iranian influence. And even the countries who are at odds with each other, UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, even though they have their differences between them and they've tried different ways of dealing with Iran, nobody is comfortable with Iranian influence in the region and wants the Iranians running wild. Everybody wants a check and balance on them.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that what we are establishing there, and with the Iraqi parliament, and again, this is debatable, and perhaps you can shed some light on whether they actually voted to ask us to leave, or if this was a letter that somebody leaked from a whistleblower's protected document file, or whatever it is.
Well, look, I mean, the parliament voted for the Americans to leave. It's largely a symbolic vote. It's not binding in any way. It's a caretaker government. The government can't even implement it. And looking from the Iraqi perspective, as I think most folks know, Iraq's made up of Kurds, Sunni, and Shia. Kurds are very pro-American. Mm-hmm. They'd be the last people that would want us to leave. Matter of fact, if we left, they'd probably just try to break away and form their own country. The Sunni don't want us to leave, even though they were formerly the people that supported Saddam Hussein. They're the minority in the country. If we leave, they're at the mercy of the Shia. Mm-hmm. Even the Shia are split between Shia that don't want their country to be taken over by Iran, and Shia that are being paid off and controlled by the Iranians. So I think everybody recognizes that if the Americans actually did leave Iraq forever, essentially Iraq would become a suburb of Iran. That could lead to a civil war. Could lead to worse.
Mm-hmm. So actually, it would be more destabilizing and worse for the Iraqi people.
Oh yeah, they'd be the big sufferers here. Absolutely.
Well, and I guess that's when we ousted Hussein, it was pointed out by some folks that you needed to have kind of that dictatorial strongman to keep. I think it was John McCain who said that, really it's three countries, his three-country solution to Iraq once we had ousted Hussein. But is it possible to govern?
The problem was Iraq couldn't survive as three countries because on alone none of them were either coherent enough or strong enough to really survive independently. Kurdistan would have issues with Turkey. The Sunnis are too small and they don't have any resources. They don't have any oil, and the Shia would get taken over by the Iranians. So this is three separate countries. It's like, dude, you get one country or you get Syria. You pick, because you're not going to have three separate countries that live in peace. It'd be like, three smaller pieces of the pie that would just encourage other people to start squabbling over them.
Is there and I guess it seems like, as you were saying, we have been fairly successful in a very volatile area at keeping things going forward, at least. Can we be a better example? I mean, I hazard to say that with the way Washington has become with the Pelosi and Schumer Democrats versus the Trump Republicans. But can we show?
And which I think the president's trying to do, which is, we tend to wax and wane on the Middle East. We try to jump in with both feet and solve every problem, and that fails. We try to walk away and pretend it's not there, and that fails. What we need to do is have a sustainable footprint, sustainable engagement that is, from our vantage point, equals to our interest, protects our interests. We're not trying to solve the world's problems, but we're not turning away either. If we're engaged in a sustained way, it protects our interests. It's more likely to create enduring partnerships. It's more likely to get people to look at the economic and political freedom reforms, which would make the region more stable and more successful. That's the balance that we need to find. We haven't struck that balance since the 1970s. We've, since Jimmy Carter put his, the Carter Doctrine in place, we have gone one way and the other. So I think the president's instincts are exactly right here. We'll see if he can put it in place, and then B, get subsequent administrations to sustain it.
Jim, thank you so much for your insight on this. We could go on for another hour because, like I said, I feel like we're checkers experts broadcasting a chess match because there's so many moving parts in it, and what you're talking about right now is something that is going to impact something 6 months from now that we don't even know about. So I appreciate your insight, and we'll have to continue this conversation at another time. But thank you so much for joining us this week.
All right, thanks for having me. It's a
Not at
great
all.
show. Really appreciate you including me.
No, are you kidding? They're happy I get included in this. Thank you all for listening, and for all of us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. 2020 is going to be a busy year, and more to come on the Virginia General Assembly as it starts to get its wheels under it in the weeks to come. Until then, for all of us here, I am Joe Thomas. So long, and thanks for all the fish.